Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. Joining me today is Antwan Harris. Antwan and I met at a conference in Pittsburgh earlier this year. Antwan is an absolute stud, and I love the energy that he brings to the room. Today, Antwan and I are going to be talking about his experience working with the UMass women's soccer team. In particular, we're going over conditioning and other strategies to help get your athletes ready for the season. So we cover a lot of different things from conditioning to the drill library that Antwan developed to overall energy systems, assessment, and load management, and so on. So this is a really great episode, and I really like the approach that Antwan takes to it. I think you're going to learn a lot and love this episode as well. Be sure to share it with a friend who could benefit from listening to the information that we shared today. This episode and every episode in season 5 is sponsored by ISOFIT. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training and can help you and your athletes win more and hurt less. For more on ISOFIT, you can check the description below. Enjoy. Antwan, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time, man.
Thanks for having me. I am looking forward to chopping it up with you. This officially is my first podcast. I was telling someone I've been doing this sports performance thing, training thing for a long time, and I haven't had the opportunity properly present itself. So I am honored to be the first, this to be my first podcast. And so I'm looking forward to providing as much detail and experience to all questions and scenarios that you provide.
Yeah, no, and I think this is going to be incredible because, Antwan, one of the first things I noticed about you is you bring this sort of energy to whatever room you're in, whether that's a conference with literally hundreds of other people there, or the stuff that I see you doing on Instagram and on socials that way with the teams that you work with that way. It seems like you're always bringing this energy to the environment that you're in. And I really value that and I really appreciate that. But for people who maybe didn't get the opportunity to meet you at an amazing conference in Pittsburgh or aren't familiar with the work that you're doing that way, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all that you do?
Yes, my name is Antwan Harris. I am 38, soon to be 39. I am approaching 2010, 2009, something in that range. I like fell in love with this thing called training and realized that after my own sports pursuit, I was a football player, that I was going to be on the side of really being a part of providing care for athletes. I have my master's, I have my CSCS. I'm a former gym owner. I have, with great humility, trained anywhere from 250 to 400 clients. And that's really a shot in the dark. I don't really try to keep a track, but between the business and working as a high school strength coach, now being at UMass, Amherst, Minutemen, I have had so many experiences, rich experiences. And I think what comes naturally to you and what will be difficult for other people is what we should consider as an area where we should pursue in life. And for me, what you said, energy, enthusiasm, that's been natural for me since the very beginning. And I've always loved training, always been enamored with the human anatomy. It's just so amazing to me. And so I won't give you too long-winded of an answer, but I am someone that loves what I do, been doing for a long time, and I don't anticipate stopping anytime soon.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. And I think there's something to be said about doing what you love and loving what you do. And at the end of the day, that's something we want for everyone. I think that, passion is something that you can very clearly and easily see in someone. And that's certainly something that you've displayed in the strength and conditioning world. I'm a bit interested to hear, though, you mentioned that you kind of grew up on the football side of things yourself as an athlete, but now you're in the other football world working with women's soccer extensively. How did you get involved in the soccer, the sport of soccer that way from a strength and conditioning coach standpoint?
Funny story. So I was at a high school, Windsor High School here in Connecticut, where I reside, and I had been training athletes privately, obviously, for a while because I had a business. And when I slowed down on that, I had an athlete that was a current soccer player just graduated, soccer player at UMass. And she reached out to me and she said, "Hey, so this is really random. Our strength coach just left, and you're the first person I thought about." Now, again, I'm in the private sector. And so she put my name in the hat. I didn't think much of it because, again, I'm like, usually I'm providing the opportunity. I'm older than you. But in this case, here's a younger athlete thinking about me, which I'm grateful that she did. And so the AD reached out to me. And from there, we had a conversation. I sent my documents, validating that I am who I say I am and have done what I said I've done. And then he called a few people, and next thing I know, I was on campus. And one of my team assignments was women's soccer. Now, when it comes to the sport, I don't look at any sport specifically for what they do in their sport as a limiting factor. And instead, I look at it like, okay, oxidative energy, high demand. Okay. Change of direction, decel. Okay. Tendencies for high muscle usage and injuries. That's how I look at sports. So I look at soccer just like that. These are young women that I work with between the ages of 19 and 23, and they're going to run, if it's a game value, they're going to be somewhere in the neighborhood, if you're a fullback, somewhere in the neighborhood of 9,500 yards to 11,100 yards. If you're center mid, you're typically, and these numbers are based off of Catapult, you're in the neighborhood of, if you're a starter, 11,500 yards to 13,500 yards, which if you break that into mileage, we're well over 5+ miles. And so my experience with soccer is that I understand how we apply what we know, the physiology, the proven energy systems, the demand on tissues, the types of explosive movements, the dynamic aspects. But I wasn't a soccer player. I don't have like a storied history, but I do have some pro athletes that I have trained leading up to UMass. But again, I wasn't, it didn't like give me any apprehension knowing that I was going to be with a sport that I had little experience with.
Yeah, no, and I think you outlined that perfectly, Antwan, is at the end of the day, you have to have this underlying framework or philosophy in how you approach movement, how you approach programming, how you approach strength and conditioning as a whole that way. And I think that, based on what you outlined that way, it sounds like the first piece was just kind of learning what the sport entailed. What kind of patterns are the athletes moving through? What kind of, shapes are they forming in key positions that way? And what are the overall demands of the sport? And you mentioned, the GPS side of the data that you see from an energy system standpoint. And I think that's so fascinating to me because everyone that I've talked, or a lot of people that I've talked with, think of soccer as a anaerobic sport in the sense that, the ball goes out of bounds, play stops, and then the ball comes back in and it's super intense for 20 to 30 seconds. And hey, now the ball's on the other side of the field, or now we've gained possession. We're going to pass the ball back and kind of let things settle down a little bit. And they view soccer as a very anaerobic energy dominant sport. But I think that the aerobic system plays a key role because, as you mentioned, they're covering miles and miles of distance every single game. And a lot of times they're playing multiple games per week. So on that energy system side of things for a second, what's your overall approach and how do you go about developing, multiple qualities of energy system for the sport of soccer that way? Because like I said, it's fairly unique and I don't see a whole lot of other sports that require, the endurance to last a full 80-90 minute game in addition to the ability to, complete multiple repeat, max effort sprint bouts, during that time that way.
So like everything, you have to be continually building capacity, number one. Number two, you must have progressions built in, which can happen a lot of different ways. Progressions could be we're going from a 1-to-4 work to rest ratio to a 1-to-3. Could be increase in reps. So you go from 4 reps to 6 reps, for instance. Here in summer 2 of women's soccer, I have 3 weeks with them. And in the 3 weeks, I have attempted to build capacity by exposure to various different energy systems to the point you made, right? So we do max effort bouts, repeat excels. We do tempo work within the same session. We do agilities that are on the higher IMA, inertial movement analysis for catapult, for those who understand that, right? And so when I take into account how I lay it out, we're going after it from various different levels. Now, I do provide details for my athletes. However, the details that I provide are enough for them to understand the assignment on the day. And for me, if I can have each day have components that resemble a game or a intermediate day, because our coaches consider our practice scheme as low or intermediate. Obviously, a game match is a beast of its own. And so if I can have days where we're tapering our intensity, the amount of distance that I'm asking them to accelerate or sprint, the rest periods, depending on the type of day we're doing it, a type of day in the training modality, I'm expanding their aerobic and anaerobic systems, which are obviously intertwined. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think you broke that down really well. And, you're right in the sense that it seems like you can take a lot of the same things and change some of these other factors and variables you outlined, like the rest period in between bouts, and
Right,
change the adaptation that you get accordingly, right? So, for
right.
example, maybe we're in the off season, if there is such a thing as off season for soccer,
Yep,
and we want to develop top end speed. Well, we can take some of those things that you just mentioned, especially the
yep,
sprint work, and we
yep.
can do super long rest periods, and we can
Right,
really push the envelope on top end speed. But,
right.
when season rolls around that way and we're in season or approaching the season that way, and our value is how can we get this athlete in good condition fast, I think interval work holds a really strong place in the training regime, not
Yep.
just from the physical standpoint, but you mentioned before how much you like physiology. I think there's plenty of research out there that supports interval training and its ability to support mitochondrial biogenesis, which is like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, if I can literally have my athletes train and increase the amount of mitochondria they have available, so
Sure,
increasing their ability to produce energy, that's going to help me from a
sure.
performance standpoint. So, but what does that look like? Well, now we're going to shorten our rest periods, right? So it's a lot of taking similar things and just changing the parameters around them by the sounds. And I think that's something that is very overlooked, right? Everyone is always looking for the new thing or the different way or the,
Mm.
extra sexy found on Instagram way of, conditioning. When in
Yep.
reality, a lot of times it's taking what you already do and just repackaging it or repurposing it.
That's it. That's absolutely spot on, my friend. So this year, on that same note, right? Uh, the plans that I have are only predicated around building capacity, broadening their ability to have repeated sprints, increasing spatial awareness, to get them ready to hand them over to training camp, their coaches for training camp, which starts on Tuesday. So Friday will be the last day of summer 2, and the whole point of me even having a job at a university for said teams is to ensure that when they come to me, I am mitigating, minimizing, understanding, delineating where their chain is weakest, providing enough intel for them, an athlete, to be able to extrapolate what I'm really telling them without going too deep in the weeds. We need to focus on this because this is trending in this direction. And trending in this direction can lead to a myriad of things that you don't want to deal with.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a great point. And I'm going somewhere with this, but I'm just curious. Last year, when you were in season that way, did your soccer team have any overtime games, or how many overtime games do you typically expect in a season that way?
2, 3, right?
But it's one of those things. Now we've got 2 or 3 games that are going even longer than we planned for. Right.
Right.
So from the energy systems development standpoint, I think a lot of times coaches are making their plans and they're considering, okay, well, the game's going to be 90 minutes.
Right.
Well, what happens when you have those 3 overtime games? Or what happens if all 3 of those are in the same month? Or on
Mm,
top of that, there was someone I was talking with recently as a strength coach where their team ran into 8 overtime games in a single season. So
wow.
now that's literally the addition of workload wise. If that's 30 minutes of overtime times 8, that's an additional 2 to 3 game workload in the
Right.
season. So it's a matter of how do we account for that? And I think that from the energy system side of the conversation, there's something to be said about what I call a buffer zone or the ozone layer, so to speak, and
Yep.
making sure the athletes are prepared a little bit more than you think the season is going to demand, just
Right.
as that extra little cushion, just in case things, do run a little bit longer that way.
Right.
And
Right.
the other piece that I really like that you brought up as well is like, you've already started on that, right? Like you've started early. I think a lot of times athletes and coaches, they make this big push 1 or 2 weeks right before the season starts to get in the best shape of their life.
Right.
And then they push their workload 0 to 100 in no
Yep.
time at all. And we
Yep.
run into issues. And as you
Yep.
mentioned, your role is, hey, here's what I'm seeing. How can I provide value to the athlete in this sense? Well,
Yep.
plain and simple, I think that slower build up, slower ramp up approach that you outlined that way provides a ton of value because
Yep.
now we're able to build slowly, maybe, 10%, 15% hypothetically a week,
Yep.
increasing workload as opposed to 50, 60, 70% jumps in workload. Because, when we see that kind of stuff on the data, we all know what's going to happen
Yep.
eventually. It's a ticking
Yep.
time bomb.
It's true. And so what I've done is created for the coaches a drill library that shows, to keep things really simple, player load, which are all the metrics that Catapult uses, um, placed into an equation that gives us a number to let us know how each drill is relative one to one another as a part of a practice plan, as a part of a practice week, understanding that we have to have days that are going to be tapered, days that are going to be high, that days are going to be more on the intermediate side, right? And then a low day, which would be obviously 2 days out from a game, right? So, or sorry, one day out from a game, which is pretty much just a walkthrough. And so, understanding the coach's playing style and being selective of how you share information, you build and earn your trust of your coaching staff, which I like to say that I'm still always trying to do that, but have a good I have a good 401k of established trust, so to speak, right? I can easily dent it without taking the time to review, to be self-aware, to push what I have in mind versus what is actually being presented, both in body language, sports science, information from team builder, feedback from the coach, from the captains, and actually my face-to-face conversations, right? All of those also play a big factor in like managing how prepared we are post overtime game the next week where we have another big competition coming up.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I think it's something too, we were talking about before we even got on the recording that way is there's so much value that you can provide as a strength and conditioning coach. And sometimes I feel like it might go overlooked how much you can do and how much you can, contribute to the success of the team for that year. But you're right in the sense that, trust and integrity take a long time to build, but seconds to destroy. And for every coach that I've seen that's impacted their team positively, I've unfortunately seen one who's, impacted them negatively. And, it was, in a different sport, not soccer, but it was the concept of, hey, we're all going to 1 rep max our squats the day
Mm-hmm.
before our first competition for the season. And
Mm,
believe it or not, that didn't really go too well for the
right.
athletes that way. So it is one of those things. But like you kind of outlined and mentioned that way, it's kind of like that self-monitoring and that self-litmus test in the sense of like you have to
Yep.
ask yourself, is what I'm doing in the best interest of the athlete? Does it align with what the coach and team is trying to accomplish, and so on that way? And I think as long as you do that at the end of the day, you're going to be steered in the right direction.
Spot on, spot on. And I really live by that because for me, honestly, I don't have any time to allow my ego to fester. I have way too many eyes, young people that are relying on the words that I'm giving them. So when I say things, it has to come from a place of objective truth, and it needs to have full transparency as far as how I got to that before I said it, and then be able to feel that when I say it, I'm coming from a place where, all right, I know he's telling me that because he means 100% well for me and for us. So that is definitely my approach with my teams, specifically women's soccer.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great approach. And it's one of those things where it really humanizes that approach to strength and conditioning, which is something I feel like we talk about a lot on the podcast that way.
Mm-hmm.
On the energy systems development piece for a second again there, I realized as we were talking, we talk about conditioning and, developing the athlete and so on that way. But I think one of the other unique pieces about soccer is the sheer volume of cutting and change of direction contacts that we see in these athletes, especially women's soccer. And I think that this is a sport where, again, talking about providing value and doing right by people, I think this is a sport that has been long plagued by the non-contact ACL injury and non-contact knee injury bug that way. And it's one of those things that I think we're starting to realize how prevalent this issue is, and we're starting to realize we need to do more and we need to catch up from a research standpoint. But I think that, a lot of people just don't understand the sheer volume of change of direction contacts and cuts that these athletes are making in practice and in-game situations. So from your end of things on the data side of things, I know you mentioned the total yardage that you see before, but how many accel, decel, change of direction contacts are you typically seeing in the athletes that you work with? Does it vary by position? And how do you go about, planning for that or adjusting, individualizing approach? And, you can reword this however you want, but how do you go about accounting for the individual variability that we see in change of direction in these athletes by position and preparing them for that kind of stimulus that they're going to undergo as a result of the sport that way?
Okay, so that's a very, very, very loaded question, but
there's
I'll
a
keep
lot
it.
to unpack here, I know.
Oh yeah, so I'm going to use some details that if you were in my space that will be applicable for me. So movement profile as a part of catapult, right? That's a big one, right? So looking at the movement profile for football with women's soccer, this takes into account the multi-directional sport and periods of low intensity where you might be walking, turns into a jog. When you then plant, shuffle, you open up. So I have a dashboard where there is medium, high for football dynamic movement profile, and on the day for each drill. So with each drill, I can look at, okay, in this drill, there were no soccer-like movements. In this drill, there were more soccer-like movements. And I manage it that way, right? For instance, period one, drill one, had 3 minutes of low football-like movements, football being soccer, of course, for clarity. And so, again, standing-like movements, walking, running, jogging, curvilinear run, plant, open up, and then high. The duration plays a big factor. Why? Because this is a sport and this is their mode of movement within their sport. So in my opinion, each sport has a lifeline, right? From the start of the offseason, end of the offseason, start of the season, preseason, end of the season. If you use too much, this is my very basic way of providing rationale for this. If you use too much football-based movements in your preseason before you get into your meat and potato, you will see a drop-off in performance, i.e., residual fatigue, lack of pop, lack of being able to like explode, okay, within the sport for what they do, okay? And so that's one way that I quantify it. The other way that I quantify it would be to look at the practice plan, which I'm creating a drill library for the coaches. And because I'm creating a drill library for the coaches, I am able to delineate a drill, its duration, its intensity per minute, the type of relative strain internally on the athlete with heart rate exertion. And I can go deep down a rabbit hole per position, et cetera, et cetera. And so to keep things simple, because again, this is a loaded question. Right now, we're in phase 1 of the season, summer 2. Training camp starts on Tuesday. That's phase 2, right? Now I'm going to provide the coaches with information. That information is going to be simple and straightforward. Here are the drills we've done. Here's the colors. These colors represent X. These colors represent Y. Anything that has this color is noteworthy, as in it ran long. It was really intense for the following reasons. It was one that would be comparable to match play. I provide that information as a part of the drill library, and then I provide with the coaches. I get feedback. Okay, these are our drills. They were deemed to be intense objectively speaking, based off of the catapult. Does this make sense? And then now I bring them into my world without necessarily having to make them cut up practice, understanding the details of what planning and cutting is relative to the position, relative to our scheme, which we're small-sided possession type of offense. So we're going to have more like lower IMAs or moderate cuts, not as many, because we're looking to possess the ball. We're looking to possess the hell out of it. We're looking to have you go back and forth, and when you get tired, we strike. In summation, to try to answer your question again, I use that. I also use the 3 proven stages of neuromuscular decline. So I use force plate usage, right? Just jump mat, BBT, right? All of this is information that can be used over the course of now and into the thicker portions of the season. But I gotta constantly like refine this, because I can't say, okay, this is our holy grail, this is what we do. I have to look at it in 3 to 4 week spans, right? What we've done now for summer 2 leading into the preseason gives me a good base, but my job isn't done, because 3 to 4 weeks from now, we'll have the first 2 to 3 games of season played. And now and then I would have to go back to the preseason in those first 2 exhibition games to be able to like provide recent information, data, to help my coaches understand how much we need to change up our approach. I hope that answered your question.
You outlined that so well, Antwan, and there's a few things I really want to kind of follow up with here. I mean, first off, the drill library that you outlined is absolutely incredible. And going back to the point I made earlier about, the value that strength and conditioning staff and professionals can provide to their team that way, I think that's absolutely huge. And it provides that deeper knowledge and understanding about like what we're developing through the drills that we do in sport, in practice that way. And I think there's so much value to that. One, it enhances the coaching staff's knowledge of what they're doing and what effect they're having on the athlete. But 2, I can go around and I can use that from a strength and conditioning standpoint and say, hey, look, we're already developing these things enough in practice. I don't have to spend any of my limited time with the athletes on there, because they're already developing it in practice. So I think having that bigger depth of understanding of what they're doing and what effect it has can certainly play a key role on that performance side and on that coaching side. But I'll even take it a step further. For me, on the rehab side of things as a clinician that way, one of my big things that I really value in the athletes that I work with is, if you come to me, I'm going to get you back, period. I don't want you to be in that that bottom third stat that everyone always references, especially with knee injuries that way. 1 in 3 don't get back, period. I don't want that for the athletes that I work with. I want them to come back either at the level or ideally beyond the level that they were at before. But how do I know what that level is if I
Right.
don't know where they were at before?
Right.
And on that note as well, a lot of times, we use hop testing, jump testing. You mentioned like force plates and jump mat. Like we have all of those in the clinic that way. But I've noticed that athletes can be really good at those, and then they go back to soccer and they just don't necessarily feel right, or it just doesn't look natural to them. And it's one of those things where I would love to bridge that gap. And like you mentioned on the GPS data and some of the other data that you've done from a drill standpoint, I would love if we could even apply that from a rehab setting and say, hey,
Right.
look, we have data on this athlete before they were injured. This is what
Right.
it looked like doing this. Now let's do
Right.
that and compare the data and see, oh wow, their contacts, the amount of cutting that they do is
Yep.
down 50% still. So that tells
Yep.
me, hey, maybe they don't really trust that knee too much, or
Right.
hey, they're not covering near as much distance. The
Yep.
contacts are there, but they're just not moving as much. So why is that? Did we not do enough of a job conditioning them? Did we miss something from a strength standpoint? And just kind of having those deeper conversations that get informed by the data to a certain extent, but also conversations with the athlete as well to,
Right.
further enhance how we can provide for them. I think that drill library piece is huge, highly underutilized for what it could be used for, and it's something that I see value in for any athlete in any sport at any level. On top of that too, as you're talking, I feel like you seem to really value the collaboration piece and what you do
Mm-hmm.
from a strength and conditioning coach standpoint. And I think those conversations that you mentioned you have with your coaching staff and
Yep.
understanding the style of play that they're looking to bring from
Yep.
a soccer standpoint and so on, that way is huge because, you can kind of change your approach based on what your head coaching staff is looking for, or the system they're trying to run, right?
Right.
Like if they're looking for a very run and gun style offense where
Right.
they're reliant on being faster than the other team, which, I see that quite a bit in the high school level, especially. Well, if I can build fast, resilient athletes, then that's going to be really valuable to the coaching staff. Likewise, in your case, if I can have really well conditioned athletes and we can possess the ball and tire out the other team and then take advantage of opportunities, that's incredibly valuable. But ultimately, if you're not on the same page with your coaching staff, you're ultimately just kind of guesstimating what to do.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think those conversations that you have that way are really important and essential.
They are. And it's a it's growing pains, right? So like they have to get used to how you communicate. You have to understand how they're communicating. It's a process, right? Any good team has its growing pains. And I think we're a team that's grown together, I think, quite well and are definitely trending in the right direction. Looking forward to this season.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. I guess I'll ask the other piece to this too is once in season comes around, how does your role from the strength and conditioning perspective, does it change at all compared to the off season?
Mm.
Does your athletes, do you lift in season, or what does that kind of in season, just general approach from your standpoint look like? What kind of things do you do with the athletes that way, or what do you value in season?
So I obviously value doing some kind of strength training where you're shortening and lengthening the muscle, and we do just that. Our coaches again, I've built quite a 401k, approaching the fourth year now here at UMass, and that again has come with me saying what I'm going to do and doing what I say I'm going to do, right? Which is a big thing, right? So we have more of a Euro style approach when it comes to strength and conditioning, meaning instead of coming into the weight room, our coach maximizes the time out on the field. So I'll bring certain set details out to, there's certain details already in our shed. So we got bands, we have kettlebells, we have other, apparatuses that we utilize that is a big component to what we do out on the field. And so the coaches said, how can we maximize so we can get more soccer tactic and strategy while doing your strength and conditioning? So I was like, oh, I mean, that's pretty easy. Well, you just need to order this. You need to order this. And you can just keep that out at the field in the shed. And so what I do is I show up on a Tuesday with said items. I'll come up with a scheme that's somewhat in the neighborhood of like functional, interval, multi-planner, ISO, control tempo, no different in the weight room, but we're doing it out on the physical field. So we got the TRX up on the fences. We're getting it going, Coach. We're getting it going. We're getting it going. We're getting it going.
I love that. And, I think that approach is incredibly valuable to the athletes, the coaches, and so on that way. I mean, first off, you're meeting the athletes where they're at on the field.
Right.
And I think what better environment to train at than literally your home field of play that way. The other piece, we talked about this recently on the podcast with Molly Vanetti, and she was like, yeah, a lot of times we just keep the main thing, which in season for you, the main thing is soccer. So how can I support and enhance that? And, Molly brought up the point where it's like, does increasing our squat 1 rep max 5 pounds in season really mean anything? Probably not. What means something is the athlete ready to go and available when their position or when their number is called to go into the game and perform. So you can kind of, keep the focus on how can I provide for the athletes and keep them in the game during the season? How can I keep them strong? How can I keep them resilient? I think that goes a long way, because I think a lot of times people get very caught up with this concept of trying to do a little too much or maybe more than we need. And I think that, the dose required to maintain or improve strength is really a little bit less than we might think it is. And sometimes we get addition by subtraction, and, I call it removing the fat of the program, so to speak. A lot of times we don't need 50, 60 sets of legs in season, especially soccer, where it's a very lower body dominant sport. So doing enough to maintain, but allowing, soccer as a sport to be the main emphasis, I think is really essential. Yeah,
I agree with you. Effective minimal dose, my friend. I operate in that space, and I'm no wizard, but I'm big on feedback. I'm big on body language. I'm big on what the coaches are saying, because even though I've earned the trust, what I've learned is this: body language is going to tell you one thing. Coaches are going to say another thing. Players are going to then go back to coaches and say, hey, listen, what we did with Coach Antwan today was like really hard. And I relish in that feedback, because there's only one thing to do when you get feedback like that. You get better. As if your ego is not, creeping around the corner, right? You get better. You can understand. You can quickly decipher if you're on track. And so for me, I have to push all of my years of experience to the side. And I say today, at this point, I have this plan. When we get to this point, we will reassess. And I literally tell our athletes this question. I make this statements to our athletes. Listen, the goal is 3. When we get to 2 and we went through each circuit, each exercise, you guys are going to tell me how we feel. Now, of course, I have enough oversight to be able to say, okay, that's a loaded movement. Anything where I have a tempo of 4 seconds or more, or if I'm holding longer than 10 to 15 seconds in set position, is going to have some residual sore DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. And so it's the effect where you want to give what's necessary, but you got to play into the placebo of, oh, I'm so sore from doing what we did. Oh my goodness. Oh, okay. I apologize. Next time, what we'll do this instead. So you got to play into it, but it's understanding enough about your team and your demographic so that you can honestly do what's right, and then adjust enough so everyone feels like they have a voice to speak. So,
yeah, and that comes from building relationships with the athletes and the people that you work with.
Sure. Spot on.
Yeah, and I mean, that's something that I feel like comes up all the time on the podcast, and we could probably do a whole podcast episode on that importance of just building a relationship and rapport with your athletes, because
Right.
at the end of the day, if they don't trust you and they don't like what you're doing, you're going to be less effective. So getting them to
Period.
understand that you have their best interest in mind and you're going to try and meet them where they need to be met. I think that's incredibly valuable, again, across the gamut of sports that way, not just
Right.
soccer. But, Antwan, I feel like you and we could probably talk about soccer and the strength and conditioning elements of it all day until we're blue in the face that way.
Oh yeah.
Do you have
Oh
any
yeah.
do you have any closing thoughts or closing remarks or anything that we might have missed as we were chatting today, man?
So, on this subject matter of soccer and things that we, being the practitioners, we have a big role. Like, we have to decipher the chaotic studies that come out that combat things that were debunked or demystified years ago. We have to look at that, understand what the most recent data is saying, and play somewhat of a judge in okay, I want to do that, but I want to do that when we get to this point. Or I want to implement these things, but it has to be when we've checked these boxes. And so for me, my closing remarks are systematically, we all have to get better at managing our process, choosing when to implement tons of new things. Do we do it over the course of 9 months? Do we do it the course of 18 months? And then are we really being professional about our own development, i.e. the conference where you and I first met? Are we really spending time being transparent, being vulnerable? Like, listen, I understand what my strengths are, but I struggle in this area. And I know you're really good at this. What is your feedback on how I'm going about doing this? Right? So, for me, just a continued learner, being selfless. Because I think if you can do those things, you'll never become complacent.
No, I think that's a great point. And I really cannot emphasize that point enough on continued learning and always asking the additional questions that way. And it's funny because at that conference, I think Stu brought that up in his presentation that way about, all of these things are great, but where does it fit into your framework? And you have to
Right.
ask those questions and determine that yourself, because, anytime you open up Instagram, you're exposed with thousands of new ideas for strength and conditioning, but that
Yep.
doesn't mean that those thousands fit into your framework perfectly.
Yep.
So it's a
Yep.
matter of understanding and asking those questions and digging in deeper and kind
Yep.
of determining, what fits the framework that you're trying to run. And
Yep.
on that note as well, it's okay to try something and it not work as you intended. But, I like to say, don't test the depth of the river with both feet, tiptoe a little bit, go low hanging fruit first. So, before you see this cool new exercise and implement it with your entire team, maybe implement it with 1 or 2 players and get some feedback before you apply it across the board to 40 or 50 that way. So I love that point on continued learning and understanding the framework that you have, the timelines that you have, and always looking to, ask the question, how could I improve what we have that way? I think that's important.
100%. I don't think you could have said that any better, because that is a constant in our space. Your space, which I have a tremendous amount of respect for, and in my space where we're taking those that have seen you for said months and weeks and now putting them back in the swing of things. So yeah, man, I I think this is it's been awesome. I appreciate all of the opportunities to answer these questions. I didn't even get into a fraction of what I could have gotten into as far as what women's soccer at UMass has been like for me, and what I've learned, my learning curve, and my ability to honestly be transparent and be a pest to my coworkers and ask them 1,000 questions. Because if I'm not asking questions, at least if you're talking to me anyway, then to me, in my head, I'm making the assumption that I have it all under control. And my coach used to tell me, when you think you got it, is when you don't have anything.
I think that's such a great point, Antwan, and you're right. We definitely could have expanded on a variety of different topics that way, and there's so much more to talk about. So for
Sure,
people
sure.
who are interested in hearing more from you or chatting more, or asking you some of those follow-up questions, where can they find you at online? Are you an Instagram guy, or are you dancing on TikTok, or
No, when I post things, and I got to do a better job, to be frank with you. I post things and I highlight our sports. Sometimes I provide like some scientific rationale and go down a rabbit hole. I could do a lot more of that. I should do a lot more of that. Just honestly, just managing the time and balance of what goes into like putting a really good post together. But I am on Instagram, Twan Dizzle, TWONDIZZLE, and I pretty much spend most of my time social wise on that. And then I write a I write an article periodically on LinkedIn. So yeah, that's my name, Antwan Harris, AntwanHarris. But for the most part, I'm immersed in the process. And so with that being said, I don't do a ton more than that because I'm so immersed in my process. I also train privately with my business here in Connecticut when I'm not at UMass. So I'm very much so in the mix. And then I have two daughters, a wife, so I'm a family guy as well. So I'm very much so in the pressure cooker most of the time.
man, you're doing so much, Antwan. When do you sleep amongst all of that, man?
Actually, I prioritize sleep, my friend. I do.
That's good. That's
I
so good.
prior. It's very important, my friend.
That's awesome. Antwan, we'll link to Instagram, LinkedIn, all of that stuff in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there and find out everything that Antwan is up to. This is awesome, man. I really appreciate your time and for all the great work you're doing, dude. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you know what? Let's keep this going, man. For sure.
More to come for sure, dude. Round two coming soon.
Awesome. Thanks for having